It was in the later part of 1847 when a Cork magistrate named Nicholas Cummings entered a cabin in Skibbereen and was horrified by what he saw. 6 famished and ghastly skeletons huddled in a corner, barely alive, moaning in fever. Within minutes, he was surrounded by, quote, at least 200 such phantoms, such frightful spectres as no words can describe, their demonic yells ringing in his ears. Scenes like that played out across Ireland during the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, a catastrophe that devastated the island's population and ultimately changed the course of not just Irish history, but quite a few other parts of the world. In those few years, Ireland's population fell from roughly 8.4 million to 6.6 million. Around 1 million people died from starvation or disease, and about 1 or 2 million fled their homeland in a desperate escape. So today we're going to talk about the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1852, from start to finish, and we'll also get into a little bit of the politics from the British side as well, and a little bit of the aftermath in terms of immigrations, and all the rest how it affected other parts of the world, as we mentioned. So allow me to welcome you first. Hello to any newcomers, welcome back to anyone who's returning. The entire channel is ad-free. Thank you to the contributions of our patrons, YouTube members, those who visit the merch store, and the occasional donation. So, we always begin with an acknowledgement of that. Links are in the description. Otherwise, give it a like, comment, subscribe. That's completely free. Helps push us out in the algorithm. Makes YouTube a better place. Anyway, thank you very much, and let's get on with it. Eve of the famine. So we are in the Ireland of the mid-19th century. That is our setting. In the decades leading up to the famine, Ireland was experiencing quite a bit of population growth, more than usual. The population had nearly doubled since the late 18th century, reaching over 8 million people by 1845, most of whom lived in dire poverty. They were either tenant farmers or landless laborers. The vast majority were Catholic peasants, while political and economic power was held by a landlord class that was often Anglo-Irish and Protestant. Hundreds of thousands of families subsisted on tiny plots of rented land. By one estimate, nearly 24% of Irish tenant farms were 1 to 5 acres in size, and another 40% were just 5 to 15 acres. Now, on such small holdings, no crop could sustain a family as efficiently as the potato. I just think they're neat. Over the preceding century, the potato had become the lifeblood of the Irish poor, a highly nutritious plant that could thrive in Ireland's damp climate and yield abundant calories even from the poorest soil. It all made sense to go all in on the starch. By the 1840s, around 1/3 of the population, nearly 3 million people, depended on potatoes as their principal staple, and a lot of them had little or no other sustenance. A laborer's typical daily diet consisted of 10 to 14 pounds of potatoes. That's a lot. Just working it out, that is ridiculous. Occasionally supplemented with some buttermilk or oats. Well, this monoculture fostered a fragile food system, one that produced rapid population growth but left the country one failed harvest away from complete disaster. Bit of a foreshadowing, isn't it? Politically and economically, Ireland was vulnerable. The Act of Union in 1801 had dissolved the Irish Parliament and brought Ireland under direct British governance. Yet London's policies often neglected Irish welfare. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few thousand landlords, many whom were absentee living back in England, leaving estate management to middlemen. Rents were extracted from the peasantry, who in turn subdivided their plots among sons or subtenants, creating ever smaller parcels. Tenant farmers generally had no security of tenure and could be evicted at a landlord's whim, discouraging improvements to land. Decades of penal laws, though mostly repealed by the 1830s, had impoverished the Catholic majority and curtailed their education and opportunities. By the 1840s, many rural Irish lived on the brink of destruction. Observers spoke of villages teeming with beggars, cabins scarcely fit for habitation, and people dependent on the charity of the potato itself. A British official, Sir William Wilde, compiler of the 1851 census report, later noted that on the eve of the famine, quote, 2/5 of the people were on the verge of pauperism. So, you see, things are already pretty bad. Small-scale crises had certainly occurred before local famines were not unknown in Ireland. For example, the year of slaughter famine in 1740-41 that was caused by extreme cold, and there was also regional crop failures in 1817 and 1822. But those earlier disasters were either short-lived or partly mitigated by relief. In 1844, a year before the Blight, an ominous sign appeared when a potato disease destroyed crops in the United States and continental Europe. Few in Ireland were aware of this plight. Now this, a blight, was called in scientific terms Phytodora infestans. Excuse my medical terminology. They were not aware of this or the danger it posed. In any case, as 1845 began, Ireland's farmers planted their potato fields as usual, unaware that their meal in the ground was about to be lost and with it the foundation of the country, the Blight of 1845. And so in September of 1845, mysterious patches of brown-black rot began appearing on potato leaves in Ireland. The vines withered with alarming speed, and when farmers dug up their potatoes, many of them had shrunken, blackened, and decayed into a faded mush, exuding a stench of rot. Not fit for eating, that's for sure. By October, reports spread that over one-third of the potato crop had been ruined by the Blight. For many families, that meant the loss of their winter food supply. The response to this first year of crisis was initially encouraging. The British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, took action upon hearing of the Blight, and despite Britain's official adherence to the laissez-faire principles, the let-it-rye economy, which I call the Beyblade economy, Peel quietly arranged to import £100,000 worth of Indian corn from America to Ireland. Now, this Indian corn, dubbed peeled brimstone by the Irish due to its hard yellow kernels, was unfamiliar to the populace and had to be ground into meal, but it did provide some sustenance and emergency calories. Peel's government also set up public works projects in late 1845 to give employment to labourers so they could earn wages to buy food. In addition, recognizing that food prices in Britain were kept high by tariffs on grain, Peel pushed for the repeal of the Corn Laws. In a landmark decision in early 1846, Parliament voted to abolish these tariffs, ushering in free trade in grain. This was intended in part to make food more affordable in Ireland. Yet the measures could only soften the edges of a very deepening crisis. The winter of 1845–46 saw hunger and hardship in parts of Ireland, especially in the west, but outright famine was still localized. Many people survived on their meager reserves of the 1844 potatoes on Indian cornmeal. Though Peel's brimstone often caused digestive illness due to improper preparation, they just weren't used to it, or on charitable handouts. But the worst was yet to come. When the spring of 1846 arrived, there was a bit of hope. People thought they'd gotten through the worst part of it, and they planted their fields again, sometimes even breaking up new land to increase the sowing, determined to recover from the prior year's setback. Usually, when you have a bad harvest, the next year you can kind of spring back. Well, that is the idea, at least. Through early summer, the fields were green and healthy, but by late July 1846, the potato plants were in full blossom and promised an abundant yield. Things were looking pretty good. Any fears of the Blight's return were largely pushed aside as irrational. Many believed the previous year's scourge had blown over, or that using seed potatoes from unaffected areas would ensure a sound crop. However, Mother Nature gave them a devastating reality check. In the final days of July 1846, the Blight struck again. This time, it was far more virulent and widespread. One eyewitness, Father Theobald Matthew of Cork, described the swift destruction with horror. Writing in early August 1846, he recounted, quote, "On the 27th of the last month, I passed from Cork to Dublin, and this doomed plant bloomed in all the luxuriance of abundant harvest. Returning on the 3rd instant, I beheld with sorrow one wide waste of putrefying vegetation. The wretched people seated on the fences of their decaying gardens, wringing their hands and wailing bitterly the destruction that had left them foodless." End quote. Yeah, sounds pretty hopeless, don't you think? In any case, within the sound of a week, almost the entire potato crop of 1846 was lost. The whole thing gone. Unlike 1845, though, when perhaps just one-third had failed. This time nearly 100% of the potatoes rotted in fields or pits. The ghastly smell of decay hung in the air. Families that had barely managed through the previous winter now saw their remaining hope snatched away. And just like that, millions of people were left with nothing to eat for the coming year. The autumn-winter of 1846–47 marked the true beginning of mass starvation in Ireland. By November 1846, Famine had tightened its grip on counties from Cork and Kerry in the southwest to Sligo and Donegal in the northwest, and all points in between. Those who ventured into the countryside encountered scenes out of a nightmare. A reporter in County Mayo wrote of sickening scenes everywhere. The bodies of children found with green-stained mouths from eating grass, families lying dead or dying on the floors of their hovels. Now in Skibbereen, County Cork, the parish priest reported entire villages nearly empty, with the dying, the living and the dead indiscriminately upon the same floor, and unburied corpses just laid there in many cabins. Hunger ravaged the population, but disease soon followed. Famine fever, a term that encompassed a typhus epidemic, and relapsing fever began to spread among the weakened masses in late 1846. In crowded workhouse and makeshift soup kitchens, lice-borne typhus found fertile ground. The result was deadly. Fever would kill as many, if not more, people as starvation during what they called the Black 47. Now what about Britain's government? They had a leadership change. It was now led by the Whig Prime Minister Lord John Russell, after Peel's ministry fell in the midsection of 1846. They responded to the escalating crisis in 46 with policies that have been judged quite harshly in posterity. The new administration firmly believed in the laissez-faire economics and limited government. Direct food aid was curtailed. The government closed Peel's food depots in the summer of 1846 to avoid disrupting the market. Can't get in the way of people's profits now, can't we? Instead, the emphasis was placed on expanding the public works projects. And so by late 1846, some 750,000 destitute Irish were employed breaking rocks and building roads that often led to nowhere. The idea was to give the hungry work and wages rather than free charity. The same ideas that prevailed with the workhouse philosophy back in England, which, well, we all know about that. But the logistics were woefully managed. Men fainted from hunger on the roads. One official, poor law inspector William J. Brokey, described labor as collapsing in dozens on the public works, a mournful proof of their exhausted strength, as he put it. I mean, how are people meant to do that sort of work with basically nothing in their stomachs? Of course they're collapsing. Just scientifically, the will cannot overcome that lack of calories. And also the other problem was wages were frequently well below the price of food. As grain prices soared, a laborer's daily wage on the road, perhaps 8p wasn't enough to buy a meal to feed his family. Starving workers sometimes tried to eat the raw turnips or nettles they found on work sites. Well, in one heartbreaking illustration, a Board of Works employee named Cowan was found dead by the roadside in County Cork, having collapsed from hunger just a few yards from his home. Such was the malnutrition and illness among the workforce that road fever, or typhus, spread widely. Hundreds of engineers, foremen and clerks who supervised the projects also died of it. By early 1847, the public works scheme was a clear failure. It was too slow, too disorganized, and too late, and it was costing the Treasury a fortune, while yielding nothing in relief. The British government abruptly shut down most public works in the spring of 1847. But that did not stop the crisis from worsening. They were about to hit the worst year of all. The year 1847 would earn the darkest year 1847, aforementioned grim title, Black 47, in Irish memory, as it marked the peak of the famine's mortality and misery. By January, the suffering had reached a crescendo. Contemporary letters and reports conveyed the despair overtaking the land. One observer wrote, "The people are in a starving state. The poorhouse is crowded with people that are dying as fast as they can, from 10 to 20 a day. There is some kind of strange fever. Number person can be sure of their lives one moment. In some areas, bodies lay unburied for days." A woman in Queens County wrote, which was a Lois, by the way, wrote to her brother in America that, quote, "There is not room in the churchyards to bury the dead. Coffins are on the surface of the earth." Faced with this unprecedented horror, even a government committed to hands-off policies had to change tact. In the spring of 1847, Parliament passed the Temporary Relief Act, more commonly known as the Soup Kitchen Act. This measure, in effect from April to September of 1847, aimed to provide free or cheap soup to the starving, bypassing the convoluted public works pay system, a rare instance of direct government feeding the populace. Under the energetic leadership of Quaker and civil servant Sir Arthur W. Trallian's wife, Lady Trallian, Soup kitchens and depots were established across Ireland. By the early summer of 1847, over 3 million people were receiving daily rations of soup or stir-out, a porridge of Indian meal from these kitchens. For many, this literally meant the difference between life and death. Though soup was often nutritionally meager, sometimes dried it as peasant soup of oatmeal, vegetables, and maybe a little meat. Maybe it's a struggle. Maybe. The program was relatively successful in temporarily staving off mass starvation. Accounts from the time note the endless queues of skeleton-like figures at the soup pots, eagerly taking the ladlefuls of broth. A French visitor, Gustave de Beaumont, remarked that one could identify famine victims by the green hue on their faces. It's 'cause they were eating so much grass and weeds before the soup kitchens opened. Even as soup relief helped through the summer, disease reached its apex in 1847. Typhus and relapsing fever raged, so did dysentery due to weakened bodies and poor sanitation and scurvy, because the loss of potatoes meant the loss of vitamin C. Relief workers and clergy were among the victims. Doctors, nurses, and priests died in alarming numbers after tending the sick. And well, they needed as many doctors, nurses, and priests as they could get. In the Black 47, death was a constant presence. In the worst district, 10% or more of the inhabitants perished within the year. One newspaper described the odor of decaying flesh hanging over the countryside, and children with bloated bellies wandering in rags. In the West, people dropped dead on the roadside or in ditches, sometimes with grass still clenched in their mouths. Reports of cannibalism, though rare, did shock the public. The Cork Examiner, in early 1847, recounted a ghastly story of a starving man who resorted to eating the flesh of a shipwrecked corpse washed ashore. The heart and liver, quote, the maddening feast on which he regaled himself and his perishing family. Well, this was reprinted in London's Times, horrifying readers in Britain and abroad. Extremes like that, well, they just show the desperation gripping parts of Ireland. Throughout 1847, the British government continued to adjust its relief strategy. It decided that after August 1847, the responsibility for the famine relief would rest on Irish local resources alone. The Poor Law Extension Act of 1847 placed the burden on workhouses and local poor law unions. Going forward, only those who entered the workhouse or who met certain strict criteria could receive aid. The soup kitchens were to be disbanded completely. This indoor relief approach stemmed from Victorian beliefs about poverty. Only the truly destitute would accept the confines and harsh conditions of the workhouse, so it would act as a deterrent to all but the neediest. However, the reality was that by late 1847, pretty much everyone met this label of truly destitute. The workhouses, originally built to accommodate over 100,000 paupers, were swollen to over double their capacity. Disease in the crowded institutions was rife. Officials described them as fever nests. Still, to receive a meager ration, inside countless families clamored for entry. The law now included the notorious Gregory Clause, named after William Gregory MP, which denied relief to anyone holding more than a quarter of an acre of land. This forced tens of thousands of small farmers to surrender their last foothold their land in order to get food. It was a devil's bargain. Give up your home and plot, and enter the workhouse, or cling to it and starve with no aid. So many anguished peasants chose to accept relief at the price of eviction from their cottages. The human toll of 47 is difficult to quantify, but historians estimate that in a single year, hundreds of thousands died. Perhaps half of all famine deaths occurred in 47 alone. Traditional burial grounds overflowed. Mass graves and poor plots were dug to inter the coffins, where coffins were available at all. In many cases, bodies were wrapped in a sheet or just buried in the earth. 3/4 of them interred coffinless, wrote a Quaker eyewitness about one parish where over 500 of the 3,000 people had died in late 1847. As for the living, well, they were traumatized and exhausted. An American volunteer, Asenath Nicholson, touring famine-stricken districts, noted the blank stares of mothers who had lost all of their children. And he silence in villages where even the dogs and chickens had died. Ireland in 1847, in the words of one commentator, was one vast Sharrel house. Famine's lingering years, 1848 to 1852. By the start of 1848, the famine had already claimed an enormous number of lives. But the crisis was not truly over. The blight on the potato recurred again in 1848, though not as universally as in 1846. In some regions, the 1848 potato crop was a partial failure. In others, fear of blight led farmers to plant fewer acres. Meanwhile, the social fabric of Ireland was fraying. After 3 years of hunger, the peasantry's reserves, physical, economic, and emotional, were completely spent. Evictions surged dramatically in those years. Unable to pay rent, thousands of tenant farmers were forcibly removed by landlords who preferred to consolidate holdings or convert tilled land to pasture. One report from County Sligo in late 1848 noted 30 families, about 150 people, evicted in one sweep by a single landlord. Worse still, some landlords took the opportunity to clear entire estates. In one infamous case, a landlord described as a noble lord in contemporary accounts evicted 1,175 people, an entire community ostensibly to create a large grazing farm, and it was said in a bit of rumor to make way for a Protestant colony. The eviction process itself often compounded the tragedy. Sick and dying tenants were sometimes carried out of their cottages and left by the roadside, when the house was leveled right in front of them. One report chillingly noted that during an eviction, a dead body was actually carried out of a home along with the living occupants. Brutality like that sears itself into memory. It's no wonder there's a bit of bad blood between these two countries. Those evicted either crowded into workhouses if they could get in, squatted in ruinous bully houses on the bogs, or joined the flooding ranks of immigrants, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Amid this turmoil, 1848 also brought political upheaval. Inspired by the revolutionary movement sweeping Europe, the springtime of the peoples, as it was called, and enraged by British inaction, a nationalist group known as the Young Irelanders staged a rebellion in July of 1848. They hoped to ignite a war for independence, or at least force a change in British policy. However, the rebellion, centered in County Tipperary, was a fiasco. A small, ill-clad band of rebels confronted police at Widow McCormick's cottage in Ballingry in a brief skirmish, and then scattered. It did not go well. The uprising failed, earning the moniker the Battle of Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch. Its leader, William Smith O'Brien, and the others were arrested. In truth, the famine had sapped the strength of the Irish masses. Starvation left little energy for an armed revolt. I mean, you certainly need the calories for that, don't you? Yet the mere attempt underscored the smoldering resentment. British authorities imposed harsher measures, suspending habeas corpus, for example, to keep order, and as a result, 1848 passed with Ireland still in the grip of hunger and plague, but now under tighter coercion. Meanwhile, Mother Nature would deal another blow. In 1849, Ireland was struck by a deadly cholera epidemic, part of a worldwide cholera pandemic. Cholera, a waterborne disease, tore through famine-weakened communities, especially in crowded workhouses and coastal cities. One account from 1849 describes a young woman in County Mayo who, upon hearing her mother had contracted cholera, hastened to the rescue and carried her mother's corpse on her back for miles to obtain a coffin, only to die of cholera herself the next day. By 1849, the potato crop was beginning to recover in some areas, but blight still appeared sporadically in 1849 and 50. Gradually, however, the dependence on potato culture was ebbing. Those farmers who still had land started planting a little bit more variety. Oats, rye, turnips alongside the old potatoes. Relief efforts by this time had shifted towards a longer-term recovery. For example, the Quakers, i.e., the Society of Friends, as they were called, who had been very active in relief since 1846, began focusing on projects like distributing seed for alternative crops, funding fishing equipment for coastal communities, and setting up schools in local industries. These modest initiatives could not undo the huge damage, but they did help some locals back on their feet. The British government, for its part, initiated the Encumbered Estates Act of 1849, which aimed to sell bankrupt landlords' estates to more solvent buyers, a step they hoped would spur agricultural consolidation and improvement. Many destitute landlords indeed lost their lands, which were bought often by English investors or prosperous Irish grazers. Tenants on those lands were frequently cleared off by the new owners. By 1851 to 52, the Great Famine was finally losing its grip. The potato blind continued to visit Europe in occasional waves, never fully disappeared. But the worst of it was over. The Irish potato harvest of 1851 was relatively healthy, and in 1852, it was pretty good. the best they've had since 1844. Surely a wave of relief over the country. Crucially, however, the Ireland of 1852 was a very different place from that of 1844. The population had plummeted and would never again reach pre-famine levels. In many districts, especially in western and southwestern counties, entire parishes had been depopulated. Now, travelers spoke of ghost villages, rows of roofless cottages overgrown by weeds, their occupants long gone. One British traveller in 1850 noted that in parts of County Mayo, quote, "The silence is striking, where once were noises of life, now only the wind through bare stone." The small holding class of coters and labourers had been effectively eliminated. Those who survived were often those with slightly larger farms or occupations other than landless labour. They now consolidated the holdings of those who had died or immigrated. Farms under 5 acres, which had been nearly half of all holdings in 1841, were only about 15% of holdings by 1851. In mid-1852, the British government officially proclaimed an end to the famine relief measures. Normally, it was assumed, had returned. Yet normal was a cry-diminished state. The final death toll of the Great Famine will never be known precisely, but modern estimates range from about 1 to 1.5 million deaths from hunger and disease between 46 and 52. Now that constituted roughly 1/8 to 1/4 of the population. An additional 1 to 2 million people immigrated in those same years. In total, Ireland lost about 23 to 25% of its population in a very brief period. A demographic collapse virtually unparalleled in peacetime in modern history. For comparison, one commentator noted, "This is akin to a country like the United States today, losing about 90 million people in the span of a few years." The famine's tail extended beyond 1852 as well. Immigration continued. At high rates in the 50s and 60s, as many survivors decided to leave a land that seemed cursed with poverty. The grass has to be greener than this, surely. British government policy. Now, of course, the story of the Great Famine is as much a story about Ireland as it is about British government policy. Historians have long been talking about how much the catastrophe severity can be attributed to human decisions or indecision back in London. The verdict of the Irish popular memory and a few scholars has been pretty scathing. Irish nationalist John Mitchell, writing in 1861, put it like this, quote, "The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine." A famous charge that shows the view that the natural crop failure was turned into an artificial famine by misguided and heartless policies. But what were these policies and why were they so inadequate? We've mentioned a few of them. But let's, get into some more detail. In broad strokes, the British government response can be divided into 2 phases: the initial relief under Sir Robert Peel's Tory government and the main period under Lord John Russell Whig government. So that's late 1845 to June 1846 for Peel and July 1846 onward for Russell. Peel's measures in 1845-46, as discussed, included food importation, limited public works, and the repeal of the Corn Laws. Peel had a reputation as a practical statesman, willing to bend a few doctrines to alleviate distress. His actions likely did mitigate the first year of famine. However, once the Whigs took over in mid-1846, the approach hardened. The Russell administration's outlook was guided strongly by its Treasury overseer, Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, effectively the chief administrator of the famine relief. Rebellion became in many ways the personification of British famine policy and its most vilified symbol. Deeply influenced by the evangelical Protestantism and economic orthodoxy, Trevelyan believed that the famine was sent by Providence and that excessive intervention would only encourage dependency and laziness among the Irish. He wrote in 1846 that the famine was, quote, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, and that calamity must not be too much mitigated." In his view, quote, "The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people." Well, there we words from who is probably the most hated man to the Irish. Yeah, that's pretty terrible, isn't it? Pretty astonishing. Effectively, he was just blaming the victims for their plight. There reflected a common attitude, though, among many British officials. There was a sense that the Irish problem needed a fundamental correction. The poverty, the overpopulation, this perceived idleness, And the famine, tragic as it was, might lead to such a correction by reducing the surplus population and forcing a restructure of agriculture. Indeed, Durillion saw the hand of Providence in what he chillingly called an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. What a sorry, to speak in layman's terms, but that's what I think. Well, this ideological stance had concrete consequences. First, the government insisted that Irish property must support Irish poverty. They were wary of the burdening British taxpayers for what was seen as Ireland's internal issue. Thus, after mid-1847, relief costs were foisted onto Irish ratepayers and landlords via the Poor Law, even though those in the hardest-hit areas were in no position to contribute. Second, the government was reluctant to interfere with market forces by halting food exports or providing food for free for too long. All through the worst years, they never declared a total embargo on exports of food from Ireland. Consequently, while Irish peasants starved, substantial quantities of food continued to be exported. Grains, butter, beef, and pork flowed out to England, because that was just the normal course of trade, and we can't interrupt that. To many observers, this was the ultimate injustice. As one anguished Catholic priest wrote in 1849, "Ships laden with our provisions are hourly wafted from our ports, leaving starvation and death the fate of the toil and sweat that raise this food." Local newspapers regularly decry the export of oats or livestock from famine-stricken counties, but the government refused to forbid it, citing the importance of not panicking the markets or deterring commerce. Third, London's relief efforts were often bureaucratic and delayed, and some points parsimonious too, I suppose we could say. For instance, during the Black 47, when the soup kitchen system was actually saving lives, it was terminated on the original schedule despite the ongoing need. Travel and others believed extending it would undermine the return to the normal poor law operation. They also delayed acceptable foreign donations and sometimes redirected aid in counterproductive ways. Now, in one notable incident when the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Naked, offered £10,000 for Irish relief, the British diplomats, embarrassed that Queen Victoria had only pledged £2,000, requested the Sultan to scale the gift down, and he did. He still sent £1,000 and several shiploads of food secretly to Ireland shores. It's also crucial to examine the role of the Parliament and public opinion in Britain. Initially, there was a wave of sympathy from the British public. Donations were raised and charities like the British Relief Association gathered funds, eventually distributing around £400,000 in private aid. So, why can they get £400,000, but the Queen can only get what? 2. Come on. Well, as the famine dragged on, the news of violence, food riots, or the 1848 rebellion emerged. Fatigue and even resentment grew among some in Britain. The London Times in 1847 notoriously editorialized that the Irish owed Britain gratitude for all the help given, and suggested that perhaps the famine was nature's way of solving Ireland's. Basically, they were saying less Irish people, less problems to deal with. The attitude of compassion fatigue meant that by 1848 to 49 there was little political will to continue relief efforts. Now Britain did end up spending, by official records, about 8 to 10 million on famine relief. Now that sum might sound large, but consider that in the same period the British government also spent 69 million on fighting in the Crimean Wars, or that they compensated the West Indian slave owners, not the slaves. The slave owners, with 20 million in the 1830s. Well, further, much of the Irish relief expenditure was in the form of loans or was billed to Irish localities. The poor law system forced many Irish localities into financial ruin. Unable to collect enough rates from destitute tenants or insolvent landlords, some unions simply collapsed. The government's answer was the Rate in Aid Act of 1849, which imposed a special tax on the relatively less affected northeastern counties of Ster to help pay for relief in the devastated west and south. This was deeply resented in Ster, where some argued that their region had no famine due to superior industry, a claim belied by reality, of course. The friction exemplified how British policy often pitted regions and classes against each other. In Ireland, well, there wasn't much of a unified relief effort. It was all just one big mess. Emigration during and after. Now, alongside death and disease, mass immigration was the third hallmark of the Great Famine. As the crops failed and starvation set in, a powerful survival instinct drove people to seek escape by any means possible. What began as a trickle in 1845 turned into a flood by the later 1840s. It is estimated that between 1 and 2 million people left Ireland during that decade, with the peak years being 47 through to 51. The majority headed across the Atlantic to North America, to the United States and Canada. Others went to Britain. Some went all the way to Australia. This exodus transformed Ireland. It created a diaspora that would shape both Irish and global history. But who were the immigrants? Many were in dire families. Parents, children, scraping together passage money, often by selling their last cows or receiving money from already departed relatives. Others were the very young teenagers or even children sent ahead by desperate families in the hope they might survive abroad and send back a little help. In some cases, landlords organized what was termed assisted immigration, effectively paying for the poor Pattons to immigrate, as it was cheaper to send them away than to support them in the workhouses or see them die on the property. Landlords would negotiate bulk fares on ships to Canada or the US, sometimes even chartering vessels to carry evicted tenants overseas. One cynical observer noted, landlords were, quote, shifting the burden of their poor to another land under the guise of philanthropy. Yeah, I can see how they came to that conclusion. As one account details, ships leaving a west coast port like Killala or Westport in Mayo were filled with fever-stricken, destitute people whose fares had been paid by an estate, the landlord's way of clearing the land for conversion to pasture. In practice, these assisted immigrants often had very little choice. It was leave or die. The conditions on many of the immigrant vessels were notoriously horrendous, earning them the moniker coffin ships. Most immigrants were packed into the holds of aging sailing ships in steerage glass, which was essentially an open deck below with little ventilation or sanitation. Shipping laws existed to regulate passenger numbers with provisions, but enforcement was pretty lax, especially on vessels heading to Canada, which had cheaper fares and thus more overcrowding. An average passage to North America could take 6 to 8 weeks, and during the winter of 1847, some voyages stretched to 12 weeks due to storms. Passengers were issued meager rations of biscuits and water. Many starved or became ill on the journey. Infectious diseases, particularly typhus, which they would call ship fever. So many different names for typhus. Well, that ran rampant in the cramped and filthy quarters, as you would imagine. And here's a harrowing statistic. In a single month, July of 1847, 10 fever-ridden ships arrived at Grosse Isle, the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River, for the Canadian-bound ships carrying 4,427 immigrants. 804 had died during the crossing, and another 847 were sick on arrival, barely clinging to life. Overall, it's estimated that at least 30,000 Irish perished on the voyage to North America, and another 10,000 died shortly after landing from disease contracted on board. Yet, despite all of the peril, hundreds of thousands survived and they started new lives abroad. So, let's consider their destinations. In Canada, ports like Quebec and St. John, New Brunswick, received huge influxes of Irish, especially in 47. Canadian communities themselves, overwhelmed, did mount relief. The Grey Nuns in Montreal, for example, tended to orphans and the sick. Many nuns actually died in that process too. Those who lived often moved on quickly to the United States, since passage into the US from Canada was easier and cheaper than direct from Ireland. In the United States, 1847 saw the arrival of perhaps 200,000 Irish, and by 1854, over 1 million of them had landed at American ports, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, etc. American reaction was mixed. There was solidarity from many Americans, often church-based aid, since a good number of Americans were of Irish or Scots-Irish descent already. For example, the city of Boston and New York set up relief for the arriving immigrants, but naivist sentiment also lurked. Some Americans viewed the influx of impoverished Catholics with suspicion or hostility. It's here that the famous signs, "No Irish need apply," would soon appear in some establishments. But despite the hardship, the Irish immigrants and their children would go on to form the backbone of many American urban working classes, and eventually political machines, like the Tam Hall in New York, gave them a voice. It's important to note how quickly the famine Irish sought to support those left behind. Remittances began flowing from America back to Ireland as early as the late 1840s. Even in extreme poverty, immigrants in Boston or New York would pull together money to just send a few dollars home. By the 1850s, these remittances, collectively totaled millions of dollars. And ironically, they exceeded the British government's annual expenditure on Irish poor relief. Now, another significant destination was England and Scotland. Several 100,000 moved to Great Britain during the famine years. Many took the short journey on packet boats to Liverpool, which became an immediate pressure cooker. At one point in 1847, about 300,000 Irish landed in Liverpool. Of course, that overwhelmed the city. While some stayed, others spread across to Manchester, Glasgow, and London and other industrial cities in search of work. The influx was one factor in outbreaks of disease in Britain. The Irish fever of 1847 killed thousands in Liverpool and Glasgow. The British press, in a sadly familiar trope, often blamed the Irish immigrants for crime and disease in their cities, fanning anti-Irish sentiment. But nonetheless, they formed their communities there, and they often took the hardest and lowest paid jobs: the dock laborers, the factory workers, the construction. Still wasn't good for anybody at that time. A smaller but notable group of famine immigrants was sent to Australia in 1848 to 50 under a scheme by a colonial secretary, Earl Grey, which is the essay, "Me Tea, I Drink." Over 4,000 Irish orphan girls from workhouses were shipped to Australia to become domestic servants and eventually wives in a female-scarce colony. This was presented as a humanitarian and pragmatic solution. It reduced the pressure in Irish workhouses and supplied labor to Australia. While the scheme had controversies, some colonists resented the influx of, quote, useless girls, and there were culture clashes. Many of the orphans did establish themselves and have descendants in Australia today. Apart from that program, other Irish, often with a bit more means or as convicts, had been going to Australia earlier. But the famine did indirectly spur more voluntary immigration there in the later 1850s, especially after the gold rush began in 1851. That's for sure. Thoughts and conclusion. But back on the home front, the famine did not simply just end and fade away. The consequences reverberated through the rest of the 19th century and beyond. Demographically, Ireland continued to bleed people. The census of 1851 revealed the outcome from 8.4 million down to 6.6, and the population kept falling. It reached about 5.8 million in 1871 and 4.7 million in 1891. It was not until our current time that Ireland's population would climb again to the levels of the 1840s. This prolonged decline was due to sustained immigration and a reduced birth rate. The social structure of the countryside was not revolutionized. Before the famine, Ireland was a patchwork of small holdings and courtier cabins. After the famine, those marginal holdings were pretty much gone. Survivors consolidated land or shifted to wage labor. The poorest classes, landless laborers and tiny landholders, had either died or left. In their place, a somewhat more prosperous class of farmers with larger and more viable farms. Ireland's agricultural economy shifted from grain and potato tillage to pastoral farming, raising cattle and sheep for export. British journalist James Anthony Froude noted in the 1870s that, quote, "A Celtic Irishman is forced into exile that a fat bollock may graze on his small holding." A caustic sentiment, of course, of post-famine land use, and indeed, in many formerly peasant districts one saw the grass growing where once people had. The famine also catalyzed changes in landlord-tenant relationships in British governance in Ireland. In the immediate aftermath, the Encumbered Estates Act allowed for old debtor landlords to be replaced by new owners. But in many cases, these new landlords were no more sympathetic. Some were speculators. However, the shock of the famine eventually led to a series of land acts, starting in 1870 and then 1881, etc., that granted Irish tenant farmers more rights, such as fair rents and the fixity of tenure. By the early 20th century, these culminated in schemes for tenant purchase, the UK government facilitating tenants to buy out landlords. So, ironically, within 70 years of the famine, the landlord system that had dominated Ireland for centuries was largely dismantled. The process undoubtedly hastened by the demographic realities the famine created and the popular pressure from a now more politically aware Irish farming class. But culturally and psychologically, the famine left its very deep scars. Irish Gaelic culture suffered a blow. The hardest-hit western regions were strongholds of the Irish language. An estimated 1 million Irish speakers died or immigrated, accelerating linguistic shift toward English. Before the famine, perhaps half of Ireland's population spoke Irish. By 1870, the proportion was much smaller and declining. The famine thus marked the beginning of the end for Irish as a community language in many areas, though efforts in the 20th century have kept it alive. And I hope they'll continue to, in the 21st, traditional music, folklore, local customs. They also ebbed in the famine's wake as entire communities vanished. At the same time, the trauma of the famine was implanted in folk memory, but interestingly often in a muted and haunted way. For much of the later 19th century, many Irish families did not speak openly about the famine. It was as if the trauma was so great that it was co-signed to a hushed reference that even call it the year of the slaughter or the bad times. When the Irish folklorist Lady Gregory asked elderly people in Gway in the late 19th century about the famine, she encountered reticence or brief and chilling anecdotes. One reply was, "There are not enough of us left to tell what happened." It wasn't until the 50th anniversary in the 1890s, and then the centenary in the 1940s, that the famine story was more fully commemorated in a public way. Well, one measure of how the famine's legacy is now kept is how it's memorialized. Across Ireland and the world today, there were numerous famine memorials, from statues of emaciated figures trudging along the Dublin Quay to the haunting coffin ship sculptures in Toronto and Philadelphia. The famine also left a legacy in the form of institutions. The workhouse system, for example, lingered on, though greatly underutilized until the end of the 19th century. A grim architectural mind reminder in many towns of the famine's worst days. And so I suppose we can say it's one of those events that divides history in Ireland. There is a very clear before and after. The academic study of the famine has revealed it to be a rather complex issue, one of ecological disaster and also political failure. But beyond the academics, the famine endures in the collective soul of the Irish as a profound tragedy that they will never forget. So, as we conclude, it's best that we think about the memory of those who suffered and acknowledge how their story helped forge a new Ireland that somehow managed to rise from the tragedy of that great famine. And here we are at the end. What a terrible tale. Well, it's one that has to be told. I challenge you to find me many heartwarming stories from history that I can talk about. Maybe we can have a look into a few of them. I'm not sure. They're hard to find. In any case, thank you very much. I'm going to read the top-tier patrons and supporters now. Give me maybe a moment. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, the Katiana, Nicholas, Eulad Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuron, Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim Jeffrey, Jessica, Meline, Melissa. Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMS, HH Crystal, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gab, Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neptis, Alexander Gokin, Dorsey, Venita Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Ivet, Miss Mochi 11, Allison, Free American, David, Jennifer, Brittany, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mom? Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P., Lovely, Omar, About Me, Kevin, Narissa, Alazarkin, Lucy, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf, Vane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael Aworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian, Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun, 101, Brandy, Bistun, Stevie, Jessica, Scott, Gail, Emily, Jade, Jake, Demons, Stowe, Mason, John, Magenta, Dumpster, Tracy, Mossy Frog, Catherine, Ezio, Art, Autumn, Monica, Jennifer, White, Rax, Gertrude, Rose, Formal Horse, Sandpiper, Mike, Darth, Mel, Daryl, Michelle, Ezio, Melissa, Joy, Jennifer, Lindsay, Leah, Jax, Taylor, Dr. D, Neon Binaries, Skull Kid, Max, Verinius, Tater, Desa, Kine, Debbie, Chadwick, Catherine, Lily, Foodie, Scariness, Howdor, Lester, Heather, and Lindsay. Thank you very much. And if you want to become part of that distinguished team, just follow the link so you know where to get to. Anyway, that's enough from me. Go and have yourself a good meal and be damn thankful for it. Good night, everyone. See you next time.